The morning they disappear began without urgency, without omens, without the kind of signs people later swear they should have noticed. It was the sort of morning that feels almost deliberately ordinary, as if time itself was trying not to draw attention to what was about to take. The mountains stood in the distance, their peaks softened by early light, neither threatening nor inviting, just present. A thin layer of mist hovered low in the valleys, slowly lifting as the sun climbed higher, revealing trails that had been walked 100 times before by hikers who always came back. The air was cold but clean, sharp enough to wake the lungs, gentle enough to promise a clear day ahead. They gathered near the trailhead just after sunrise. Boots scraped against gravel. Zippers were pulled. Gloves were adjusted and then removed again, stuffed into pockets. Someone laughed about forgetting extra socks. Someone else double-checked a map they already knew by heart. There was no ceremony to it, no dramatic pause, just a familiar rhythm of preparation, the quiet choreography of people who trusted the plan. One of them poured coffee from a dented thermos, steam curling upward and disappearing almost instantly into the cold air. Another leaned against the hood of a car, stretching stiff shoulders, complaining half-jokingly about being talked into an early start. The kind of complaints that meant nothing, that would never be remembered if things had gone the way they were supposed to. Phones were still working then. A quick photo was taken, nothing staged, just a casual snapshot meant for later, proof of a morning well spent. No one looks afraid in it. No one looks hesitant. If anything, they look relaxed, comfortable. People who believe they know where they're going. They told someone they'd be back by nightfall. That detail would matter later. At the time, it was just a reassurance, a sentence spoken automatically. Back before dark. Back for dinner. Back before anyone had reason to worry. The trail welcomed them the way it always did. Pine needles muted their footsteps. The forest smelled damp and alive, a mix of soil, moss, and something older that couldn't be named. Sunlight filtered through branches in long, broken lines, moving slowly as the morning progressed. Birds scattered as they passed, then returned once the sound of voices faded. At first, the path was wide and forgiving, clearly marked, the kind of trail that gives you confidence, that makes you feel foolish for ever being nervous about it. They walked side by side, talking about work, about plans for the weekend, about nothing that would survive memory. Their voices echoed briefly and then were absorbed by the trees. This was not a reckless group. That point would be emphasized again and again in the years to come. They had experience. They had done this before. They knew the weather patterns, the elevation changes, the risks. They had told people where they were going. They were careful, responsible, ordinary in the most important ways. As the trail narrowed, conversation thinned. Breath became more noticeable. The incline demanded attention. Still, there was no tension, only focus. One of them stopped to retie a bootlace. Another adjusted the strap of a backpack that had slipped too low. Small pauses, insignificant in the moment, but later examined with unbearable intensity. Was this where something changed? Was this where time began to tilt? They passed a familiar marker, a bent signpost, weather-worn and faded. Someone commented that it looked worse than last year. Someone else replied that everything up here aged faster. The mountains did that to things, to wood, to metal, to people if they stayed long enough. The higher they climbed, the quieter it became. Not an ominous quiet, just a deep one, the kind that presses gently against the ears. Wind moved through the trees in low waves. Somewhere far off, water ran over rock. The world felt large and unbothered by their presence. They reached a point where the view opened suddenly, the tree line thinning just enough to reveal the valley below. It was instinctive. Everyone stopped. Moments like that always demanded silence. The land stretched out beneath them, layered in shades of green and gray, endless and calm. One of them pointed out a familiar ridge in the distance, explaining where they'd stop later, where they'd turn back. That was the plan. A simple one. Up and back. No detours. No risks. If anyone felt a flicker of unease, they didn't say it. And if they said it, no one remembers hearing it. Memory, after all, is shaped by endings. We search the beginning for warnings only once we know how the story ends. They moved on. As the morning wore on, the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist. Shadows shortened. The trail grew rockier, more demanding, but still manageable. The kind of challenge that feels earned. That makes you feel capable. At some point, no one knows exactly when, they passed beyond the places most people stopped. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just step by step, following the logic of the path, trusting that familiarity was protection enough. That was the last stretch of the day that anyone could describe with certainty. No one saw them turn back. No one saw them struggle. No one heard a call for help. There was no moment that announced itself as final. No sharp line between safety and danger. Just a gradual fading of presence, unnoticed until absence took its place. Later, when investigators would reconstruct the day, they would linger here, on the morning, on the small details, on the calm, because calm is unsettling in hindsight. It leaves no obvious place to point to and say, this is where everything went wrong. The mountains watch them arrive the same way they watch everyone arrive, without reaction, without memory, without intent. And by the time the sun began its slow descent, by the time the light shifted and shadows stretched long across the valley, the space they had occupied was already empty. No alarms were raised yet. No panic. Just a quiet expectation they would appear, tired and satisfied, boots dusty, stories ready to be told. But the trailhead remained still. And the last known morning, so unremarkable it barely deserved a photograph, slipped silently into history, unchanged, untouched, waiting to be questioned by a future that would never stop asking how something so ordinary could vanish so completely. The mountains did not announce themselves as dangerous. That was their first deception. They rose slowly, almost politely, from the surrounding land, their slopes softened by distance and morning light. From afar, they looked patient, ancient, yes, but calm, the kind of place that invited trust simply by existing for so long without spectacle. Up close, they were something else entirely. The terrain changed in ways that were subtle enough to escape notice at first. The ground shifted from packed earth to loose stone, from forgiving paths to narrow passages where every step demanded attention. Trees grew closer together in some places, then vanished abruptly in others, replaced by open stretches of rock that reflected light harshly and distorted distance. Sound behaved strangely here. Voices didn't carry the way they should. Footsteps felt swallowed rather than echoed. For those who knew the mountains, this was familiar, not alarming, just something to respect. The kind of environment that rewarded caution and punished distraction, but not maliciously, just consistently. Weather was never stable here. It could change without warning, not in dramatic storms, but in gradual shifts that crept in unnoticed. A breeze that cooled the skin, clouds that gathered slowly behind ridgelines, light that dimmed without the sun fully disappearing. The mountains specialized in transitions, so smooth, they felt natural until they weren't. As the group moved deeper, the forest thinned in places, giving way to stone corridors carved by centuries of water and ice. The walls rose higher, blocking sightlines, narrowing the world to a few feet in either direction. Orientation became less intuitive. Landmarks looked similar. Turns blended together. Even experienced hikers had to stop occasionally, not because they were lost, but because the terrain encouraged pause, demanded recalibration. There is a particular kind of quiet that exists only in high-elevation places. Not silence, never that, but a muted presence, as though the land itself absorbs excess noise. Wind loses its sharpness. Birds appear and disappear without sound. Even movement feels restrained. It's a quiet that doesn't comfort or threaten. It simply exists. Locals spoke about this quiet differently. Some described it as peaceful. Others said it felt heavy. A few used words like watchful, though no one could explain what that meant. These were not superstitions, not stories meant to scare. Just observations passed down casually. The way people talk about weather patterns or seasonal changes. The mountains, they said, had a way of keeping things. Not hiding them, not destroying them, just keeping them. Trails here had a habit of changing. A fallen tree could redirect foot traffic for months. A landslide could erase a familiar turn. Snowmelt reshaped paths every spring. Maps age quickly. What was accurate one year could be misleading the next. Anyone who spent time here learned to trust their senses as much as their equipment, and to accept that certainty was always temporary. As elevation increased, so did exposure. The forest canopy broke apart, offering wide views that felt liberating and unsettling at the same time. With nothing blocking the horizon, distance became difficult to judge. What looked like a short climb could take hours. What appeared close could remain unreachable. The air grew thinner, though not enough to alarm. Just enough to remind the body that it was a guest here, not a resident. Breathing required attention. Movement slowed naturally. Conversation became intermittent, less out of seriousness and more out of instinct. Somewhere along this stretch, radio reception weakened. Not suddenly, not completely, just enough to introduce static, to stretch voices into fragments. A message might go through on the first attempt, or the third, or not at all. This, too, was normal. The mountains interrupted signals the way they interrupted sight and sound, without apology. The land bore signs of others who had passed through before. Faded markers, old fire pits, scuffed rock where boots had worn grooves over decades. Proof that people came here, that they left, that the mountains allowed it often enough for trust to grow. But there were also places untouched. Areas where the ground looked undisturbed, where growth was thick and unbroken, where no trail was visible at all. These spaces existed alongside the known paths, not hidden, just unclaimed. A reminder that most of the mountain did not belong to anyone. Stories circulated about hikers who misjudged distances, who followed what they thought was a trail only to realize too late it was runoff from melted snow. About people who chased a view and lost a path back. Most of them were found, tired, dehydrated, shaken but alive. Those stories always ended with relief, with lessons learned, with the reassurance that mistakes here were survivable. That reassurance mattered. As the group continued, the environment subtly reshaped their awareness. Time felt different. Minutes stretched, hours compressed. The sun's position seemed unreliable, filtered through clouds that moved without urgency. Watches were checked more often, not out of fear, but out of habit. There was no single moment when the mountains felt threatening. No sudden drop in temperature. No gathering storm. No obvious hazard announcing itself. Danger here was not a dramatic event. It was a slow accumulation of small disadvantages. Poor visibility, uneven ground, fading light, compromised communication. The kind of danger that rarely feels urgent until it is. The landscape demanded humility. It reminded those who walked it that knowledge was always incomplete, that experience reduced risk but never erased it. The mountains did not react to confidence or fear. They responded only to physics, to weather, to time. By the time the group reached the deeper sections of the range, the world felt narrower, more contained. Valleys funneled movement. Ridges limited options. Choices became fewer, though none of them appeared irreversible. From the outside, it would later be described as a hostile environment, but that word never quite fit. Hostility implies intent. The mountains had none. They did not chase, did not trap, did not lure. They simply existed at a scale that made human plans fragile. What the mountains did exceptionally well was remove reference points. Familiar sounds, familiar shapes, familiar expectations. In doing so, they stripped away the illusion of control without making it obvious. They let people believe they were still oriented long after they weren't. This was a landscape the group moved through, patient, vast, unconcerned. A place where mistakes didn't announce themselves loudly, where wrong turns felt identical to right ones until time made the difference clear. And somewhere within this terrain, this maze of stone and silence, the group passed a threshold no map could mark. Not a cliff, not a ravine, just a point where return quietly became more complicated than arrival. The mountains did not close behind them. They did not need to. They only needed to remain exactly as they were. The first sign that something was wrong did not arrive as panic. It arrived as delay. By early evening, the light had begun to soften, the way it always did when the sun slipped lower behind the peaks. Shadows stretched across the valley floor. The air cooled. At the trailhead, there was still no reason to worry. At least, not yet. Plans ran late all the time. Trails took longer than expected. Detours happened. People misjudged daylight and hurried back laughing about it later. So, at first, the waiting felt casual. A car door closed. Someone checked their phone. Another person leaned against a railing near the trail map, scanning the tree line for movement. Every few minutes, someone looked up, half expecting to see familiar silhouettes emerge from the forest. Each time, the path remained empty. The promise had been simple, backed by nightfall. But nightfall was a wide margin. There was still light in the sky, still time for excuses. As the minutes passed, the waiting took on a different shape. Conversations quieted. Phones were checked more frequently, not because there were messages, but because checking felt like doing something. A call was placed and went unanswered. That, too, did not immediately alarm anyone. Reception was unreliable. Everyone knew that. Another call followed. Then another. The sky darkened further. Colors drained from the landscape, leaving behind outlines and shadows. The mountains, which had seemed distant and neutral all day, now felt closer, heavier, as if the coming night gave them weight. Someone finally said it out loud. They should have been back by now. The sentence didn't land dramatically. It just hung there, awkward and unfinished. No one responded right away. Naming concern always felt like inviting it in. More calls were placed. Messages were sent. Each one failed in the same quiet way. No response, no confirmation, no reassurance. The phones did not ring. They did not vibrate. They simply remained still, screens glowing briefly before going dark again. That was when silence stopped feeling neutral. Silence has stages. At first, it is empty space waiting to be filled. Then it becomes noticeable, pressing lightly against awareness. Finally, it transforms into something else entirely, an absence so loud it feels intentional. The trailhead grew colder as night settled in. The wind picked up slightly, moving through the trees in low, uneven breaths. Every sound carried farther now, amplified by darkness. Footsteps from passing hikers, strangers, triggered brief flares of hope that died the moment faces came into view. They were the wrong people. Every time, the last light disappeared behind the ridge. Darkness arrived fully, without ceremony. Headlights illuminated patches of gravel and brush, creating islands of visibility surrounded by black. The forest beyond felt impenetrable. The trail itself vanished into shadow, its entrance suddenly unfamiliar, almost threatening. Someone suggested waiting a little longer. Someone else disagreed. The debate was quiet, restrained, careful not to sound like panic. But it was there now, threaded through every word. Eventually, a decision had to be made, not because certainty had arrived, but because doing nothing felt worse. Authorities were called. The report was hesitant, almost apologetic. Names were given. The plan was explained. The time they were supposed to return was repeated more than once, as if saying it again might make it true. On the other end of the line, a calm voice asked procedural questions, promised to log the call, advised patience. Missing persons, especially in wilderness areas, existed in a strange category. There were protocols, timelines, thresholds of concern. Not every delay justified immediate action. Experience taught responders that most overdue hikers eventually walked out on their own. That knowledge offered comfort and dread in equal measure. Night deepened. The trailhead emptied as other visitors left. Cars pulled away one by one, their taillights disappearing down the road. The world narrowed to a small circle of light, a few worried figures in the vast dark beyond. Inside nearby homes, families began to sense something was wrong. Calls were made that went unanswered. Messages remained unread. Familiar routines broke. Dinner cooled on tables. Televisions played to empty rooms. There is a particular fear that comes with unanswered communication. Not the sudden shock of bad news, but the slow realization that access has been cut, that the invisible thread connecting one person to another has gone slack. Midnight passed. By now, hope and fear had begun to trade places. Where optimism had once lived, Unease settled in. Where doubt had been, dread began to grow. Every scenario replayed itself over and over, each one worse than the last. Had they taken a wrong turn? Had someone been injured? Had weather shifted higher up? Had something gone unnoticed earlier in the day? The mountains offered no answers. They stood dark and still, their outlines barely visible against the night sky. No lights moved along their slopes. No sounds carried down. It was as if nothing had happened at all. Search and rescue teams were notified, but mobilization took time. Equipment had to be gathered. Volunteers had to be called. Daylight was preferred for safety. The waiting stretched on, heavy and unresolved. Inside that waiting, imagination ran unchecked. Every rustle in the trees felt charged with meaning. Every distant sound hinted at movement. Headlights passing on the road triggered sudden spikes of adrenaline, only to fade into disappointment. No one slept. By early morning, exhaustion set in, not the kind that brings rest, but the kind that dulls thought and sharpens emotion. Faces looked older in the cold light of dawn. Eyes were red and unfocused. Conversations looped, returning again and again to the same unanswered questions. The mountains emerged slowly as daylight returned, revealing nothing new. The same trails, the same trees, the same indifference. When search teams finally entered the area, they did so with measured urgency. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters prepared to sweep the terrain once the air warmed enough. Maps were spread out and studied. Areas were prioritized based on likelihood, not fear. Yet even as the search began, a subtle shift had already occurred. This was no longer a matter of being late. This was a disappearance. The silence, once tolerable, had become the first and most disturbing clue, not because it pointed to something specific, but because it pointed to nothing at all. No distress call, no signal flare, no trace of struggle, just an abrupt vanishing, as though the mountains had inhaled and never exhaled. In the days that followed, this moment would be replayed endlessly. The waiting, the calls, the first night without answers. People would ask what it felt like when concern turned into certainty, when hope gave way to fear. There was no clean answer. It wasn't a moment. It was a gradual realization, settling slowly and then all at once, that whatever had happened out there had happened quietly, and that silence, in the end, was the most unsettling thing of all. By the time the search truly began, the mountains had already erased whatever urgency the night before had created. Morning brought clarity of light, but not of answers. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of day that usually reassured people that things would be fine. It felt almost wrong that the weather, so cooperative now, had not been this way when it mattered most. The air was cold but stable. Visibility was excellent. Conditions were ideal for searching, if nothing else. Teams assembled at the trailhead in quiet efficiency. There was no dramatic arrival, no chaos. Just vehicles pulling in, doors opening, equipment being unloaded. Radios crackled with low voices. Names were checked off lists. Maps were unfolded and weighted down with stones to keep them from curling in the breeze. Search and rescue worked by pattern and probability. They identified the intended route first, marking it carefully. Then they expanded outward, section by section, grid by grid, treating the wilderness like a puzzle that could be solved with enough patience and coverage. Dogs were brought in early. They were led to the last known point, the place where certainty ended. Handlers watched closely as the animals circled, noses to the ground, reading a story written in scent. For a moment, hope sharpened. Movement meant possibility. But the trails here were busy enough that scents overlapped. Old tracks crossed new ones. Wind scattered fragments in unpredictable directions. The dogs worked, then hesitated, then redirected, their confidence dissolving into confusion. Helicopters took to the air once temperatures rose. From above, the mountains looked deceptively simple. Clean lines, open spaces, defined ridges. But altitude flattened depth hid crevices, erased scale. What looked like a smooth slope could conceal drops, dense brush, or rock fields that swallowed movement. Searchers on the ground moved slowly, deliberately. Every step mattered. Every glance lingered. They called out names that dissolved into the open air without echo. They checked beneath fallen trees, behind boulders, along stream beds where someone might have slipped. They expected something. A dropped backpack, a torn piece of fabric, footprints veering off the trail, signs of rest or panic or injury. Even bad news would have been news. Instead, they found almost nothing. A scuffed patch of dirt that could have been made by anyone, a displaced stone that might have rolled naturally, marks that suggested presence but refused to confirm it, clues that existed only long enough to create doubt. The absence of evidence became its own problem. As hours turned into days, the search expanded. More volunteers arrived. The grid widened. Areas considered unlikely were checked anyway, just to remove uncertainty. Each cleared section brought a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that it had been covered, dread that it had yielded nothing. Searchers learned quickly that the mountains did not reveal their secrets easily. Visibility changed with angle and light. What was invisible at noon appeared obvious in late afternoon. What seemed obvious from one direction vanished. When approached from another, the terrain distorted perspective, making distances unreliable. Fatigue set in, not just physical, but mental. Searching demanded constant attention, constant hope. Every hour without discovery weighed heavier than the last. Families waited nearby, suspended in a state that defied language. They watched teams come and go, watched helicopters trace patterns across the sky, watched dogs return without success. Updates were careful, measured, professional. No one said the words no one wanted to hear, but no one offered reassurance either. The idea that people could simply disappear without leaving a trace felt unreasonable. It challenged basic assumptions about reality. People leave things behind. They make noise. They disturb the environment. Even accidents announce themselves in some way. Here, there was only continuity. The mountains looked the same before and after. Trails bore no obvious scars. Water flowed undisturbed. Nature had not reacted. On the third day, optimism began to thin. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. The language changed subtly. Instead of when they're found, people said if. Instead of where they are, people said where they might be. Search parameters were adjusted. Possibilities once considered remote were discussed more seriously. Could they have gone off-route intentionally? Could weather higher up have been worse than expected? Could one incident have cascaded into another? Every theory required evidence. None could be supported. The mountains remained uncooperative, not hostile, just unresponsive. They did not conceal deliberately. They simply did not give. By the end of the first week, the search had covered vast ground. Hundreds of hours logged. Miles walked. Airspace scanned repeatedly. The area of uncertainty shrank, but the truth did not emerge within it. The conclusion no one wanted began to take shape. If something had happened within the search zones, there should have been signs. That realization introduced a new, quieter fear, not that the search had failed, but that it was searching in the wrong places entirely. Operations continued, but urgency shifted toward sustainability. Crews rotated. Volunteers were thanked and released. Resources were reassessed. There was no announcement, no formal declaration, but everyone felt the change. This was no longer a rescue. It was a recovery, without anything to recover. In press briefings, officials used careful language. They emphasized effort. They emphasized commitment. They avoided conclusions. Reporters asked the same questions over and over, hoping repetition would force clarity into existence. Why hasn't anything been found? There was no satisfying answer. Privately, some searchers admitted what they would never say aloud. They had expected the mountains to give something back by now, even a fragment, even a mistake. The complete absence of evidence was more unsettling than discovery would have been, because absence suggested something else entirely, something that didn't fit patterns, something that refused to align with experience. As days stretched into weeks, the search scaled down, not because hope was gone, but because effort had reached its limits. The mountains had been asked every reasonable question. They had responded with silence. When the last organized teams withdrew, the trails remained open. Wind continued to move through trees. Weather continued its slow cycles. Hikers passed through areas that had been combed inch by inch. unaware of how closely those spaces had been studied. Nothing marked the places where searchers had knelt, where names had been called into emptiness, where hope had quietly eroded. The search had found almost nothing, and that, more than any discovery could have, changed everything. When the search ended without answers, certainty did not follow. Instead, something far less stable took its place. In the absence of facts, theories began to form, not all at once, not deliberately, but inevitably. Where evidence refused to speak, imagination stepped in. At first, the theories were quiet, almost respectful. They circulated in low voices among families, among searchers packing up equipment, among locals who knew the mountains well enough to fear them, but not well enough to explain them. These early ideas stayed close to reason. A misstep, a fall hidden by terrain, weather turning faster than expected at higher elevation. They were theories that allowed grief to coexist with logic. But time changes the way uncertainty behaves. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, speculation grew bolder. The mystery demanded shape, and if reality wouldn't provide one, people created it themselves. The media arrived next. Headlines favored questions over answers. How could experienced hikers vanish? Why was there no trace? What had search teams missed? Each article introduced a slightly different angle, a slightly different emphasis. Details were repeated until they became distorted. Timelines blurred. Small facts were magnified into central pillars of suspicion. Public curiosity fed on contradiction. One theory suggested deliberate disappearance, that the group had chosen to walk away from their lives, shedding identities in a place vast enough to allow it. It was a theory that appealed to those who believed people always acted with intention. That chaos was just a story we told ourselves to avoid looking harder. Families rejected this idea fiercely. They spoke of responsibilities, of bonds, of plans that had been made for the future. Disappearance by choice felt like betrayal layered on top of loss. Another theory focused on conflict, a disagreement that escalated, an argument that turned physical, an accident covered up out of fear. This narrative transformed ordinary people into suspects, casting shadows over memories that had once been warm and uncomplicated. Every friendship was re-examined, every offhand remark replayed. Grief turned inward, sharpening into doubt. Some theories leaned heavily on the environment, sinkholes, hidden crevices, sudden weather events that left no obvious trace. These ideas were easier to live with. They preserved the humanity of those involved, while assigning blame to forces beyond control. Then there were the darker theories, the ones that surfaced quietly, often prefaced with hesitation. The presence of others in the mountains that day. Strangers, opportunists, people whose paths may have crossed unseen. Law enforcement addressed these suggestions carefully, neither confirming nor dismissing them. There was no evidence to support foul play, but no evidence to rule out either. That neutrality, though necessary, left space for fear to grow. With every theory came an emotional cost. Each possibility rewrote the story in a different way. In one version, the missing were victims of nature. In another, of human malice. In another, architects of their own vanishing. None of these narratives offered peace. They competed with each other, refusing to settle. Online forums amplified everything. People far removed from the event dissected details with clinical detachment. They analyzed maps, calculated distances, compared the case to others. Patterns were drawn where none had been confirmed. Coincidences were elevated to clues. Some commenters spoke with absolute confidence, as though proximity to information equaled understanding. Others treated the disappearance as a puzzle to be solved for entertainment. Empathy was inconsistent. Certainty was abundant. Families watched this unfold with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. Their loved ones had become characters in a story that no longer belonged to them. Private grief was debated publicly. Speculation replaced silence, and in some ways that was worse. Authorities were pressured to respond. Press conferences became more frequent, statements more guarded. Every word was weighed, not just for accuracy, but for how it might be interpreted. The case grew larger than the people at its center. As years passed, the theories hardened. People chose a version of the story that made the most sense to them and held on to it. These beliefs became identities. To question them felt like an attack. Some locals believed the mountains themselves were responsible in a way that couldn't be explained by maps or data. They spoke of disorientation that crept in unnoticed, of familiar ground turning unfamiliar without warning. These accounts were dismissed by outsiders but persisted quietly, rooted in lived experience. Others insisted the search had been flawed, that crucial areas were overlooked, that assumptions led investigators away from the truth early on. This belief sustained hope, but also sustained anger. Every anniversary of the disappearance reignited debate. New articles recycled old information. New theories were layered over old ones. Nothing moved forward, but nothing faded either. The absence of closure created a vacuum where meaning should have been. Into that vacuum flowed suspicion, resentment, denial, and sometimes resignation. What began as an effort to understand gradually became an effort to control the narrative. Theories were no longer just explanations. They were coping mechanisms. Believing in an accident allowed some to grieve without blame. Believing in foul play allowed others to direct their pain outward. Believing in intentional disappearance allowed a few to imagine survival somewhere beyond reach. Each theory protected something fragile inside the person who held it. Meanwhile, the facts remained stubbornly unchanged. No new evidence emerged. No witnesses came forward. No belongings were found. The case file thickened with speculation rather than substance. Investigators continued to review it periodically, especially when similar disappearances occurred elsewhere. Comparisons were made, patterns considered. Each time, the conclusion was the same. Nothing definitively connected this case to any other. Theories filled the space left by answers, but they did not bring resolution. They only multiplied the ways the story could hurt. Over time, even those closest to the disappearance began to drift into different interpretations. Conversations grew cautious. Disagreements went unresolved. Grief, once shared, became individualized. The mystery had outlived the moment that created it. What remained was a fractured truth, one shaped not by evidence, but by belief. And belief, once entrenched, proved harder to navigate than the mountains themselves. In the end, the theories did not solve the disappearance. They ensured it would never rest. Time did what it always does when answers refuse to arrive. It moved forward anyway. At first, the case lingered in an in-between state. Not active, not forgotten. Files remained open. Names stayed on lists. Periodic checks were made, more out of obligation than expectation. Investigators revisited notes, retraced logic, asked the same questions in quieter rooms. Nothing changed. As months became years, urgency thinned. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because caring without progress was unsustainable. Resources were needed elsewhere. New cases arrived with fresh evidence, living witnesses, solvable timelines. This one had none of that anymore. Eventually, the language shifted. Instead of ongoing investigation, the case was described as inactive, not closed, not solved, just paused indefinitely, a bureaucratic word that carried emotional weight far heavier than it appeared to. For the families, this transition felt like abandonment. There was no formal announcement, no final meeting where someone explained that the search for truth had reached its practical limits. The phone simply stopped ringing as often. Updates became rare. When they did come, they contained no substance. Silence returned, different from the first silence, but just as unsettling. Life outside the case continued relentlessly. Jobs demanded attention. Children grew older. Birthdays arrived with empty chairs. Holidays became exercises in endurance. Conversations learned to navigate around absence, careful not to disturb it too much. Some families preserved rooms exactly as they had been left, beds made, clothes hanging untouched, dust accumulating in patterns that felt like time itself taking notes. Others packed everything away, not out of acceptance, but out of necessity. The pain was constant either way. Grief without confirmation behaves differently. It does not settle. It does not resolve. It stretches, shapeless, adapting to whatever space it's given. There was no body to mourn. No ritual to mark an ending, just a persistent question that refused to quiet. Investigators moved on professionally, but the case followed them privately. Some admitted, years later, that it lingered in their minds longer than most, not because of what they had seen, but because of what they hadn't. A mystery with no edges to grab onto. Occasionally, something would stir it back to life. A reported sighting. A tip that sounded promising enough to justify a call. Each time, hope rose cautiously, learned by experience not to climb too high. Each time it fell. Files thickened with notes that led nowhere. Margins filled with questions already asked. The case aged in paper and ink, its physical weight increasing even as its momentum disappeared. Public interest faded in waves. Anniversaries prompted brief attention, then silence again. New tragedies replaced old ones in headlines. The disappearance became a reference point rather than a focus, something mentioned in passing, assumed unsolvable. Locals spoke of it less often, but not because they had forgotten. It simply became part of the landscape story, woven quietly into conversations about the mountains. A cautionary tale without a moral. The mountains themselves did not change. Trails were rerouted. Signs were replaced. Visitors came and went, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Life passed through the same spaces where hope had once pooled and drained away. For some families, anger hardened into something solid enough to lean on. They wrote letters, requested reviews, pressed for renewed searches. Their efforts were met with sympathy and limited action. There was always regret, rarely progress. Others withdrew entirely. They stopped asking, stopped watching, not because they had given up, but because survival demanded distance. To keep the wound open forever was not an option. Years passed this way. Quietly, unevenly, the case did not end. It thinned. It stretched across decades, losing definition, becoming something that existed mostly in memory. New investigators occasionally examined it with fresh eyes. Technology improved. Methods evolved. Old evidence was reanalyzed. Still, there was nothing new to analyze, nothing concrete to re-examine. The absence remained complete. As time moved on, death visited the families in unrelated ways. Parents passed away without answers. Friends aged. Voices that had once spoken passionately about the case fell silent. With each loss, the urgency to resolve the disappearance faded further, not from indifference, but from inevitability. The mystery began to outlive its witnesses. Eventually, the case reached a point where it was referred to in the past tense. Not because it was resolved, but because everyone involved belonged increasingly to the past. New generations heard the story secondhand, stripped of emotional immediacy. To them, it was a cold case. To those who lived inside it, it was unfinished life. What made this period especially cruel was its ambiguity. There was no clear moment when hope ended, no line separating possibility from impossibility. Just a slow erosion, barely noticeable day to day, devastating when viewed in retrospect. The case did not collapse. It receded, and in that retreat, something else took hold, a quiet understanding that the truth, whatever it was, might never surface, that the mountains might keep what they had taken, not out of malice, but out of indifference to human need. This was a stage where mysteries usually fade into obscurity, where questions stop being asked because the answers no longer seem reachable, where time, undefeated, appears to win. For decades, that seemed to be the ending, until it wasn't. 36 years is long enough for a mystery to change shape. At first, the disappearance had been a living thing, sharp, immediate, impossible to ignore. Then it became history, then rumor, then something quieter still. By the time more than 3 decades had passed, the case no longer occupied space in the present. It existed somewhere behind it, like a scar that no longer hurt unless pressed. For the outside world, the story had settled into a familiar rhythm. A few paragraphs in old news archives, a mention in long lists of unresolved cases. Occasionally, a podcast episode or a forum thread would pull it briefly back into attention, only to let it drift again. For those connected to it, time behaved differently. Memories aged unevenly, some details sharpened, preserved by repetition and longing. Others faded, smoothed by necessity. Faces and photographs felt both intimate and distant, like images from a life that belonged to someone else. Birthdays continued to arrive for people who were no longer there to acknowledge them. Each passing year created a strange arithmetic. Counting how old they would be now, imagine what they might look like, what kind of lives they would have built. These calculations never brought comfort. They only emphasized absence. Parents grew older carrying unanswered questions that had no place to go. Some passed away believing, to their last breath, that answers would come eventually. Others stopped expecting them long before that, though they never stopped hoping entirely. Hope does not disappear. It changes volume. Over time, the disappearance became part of family identity, something inherited by those too young to remember the day it happened. Children grew up hearing fragments of the story, sensing its weight without fully understanding it. They learned which questions were safe to ask and which ones lingered too close to open wounds. The mountains, meanwhile, became symbolic, no longer just a place, but a presence. They stood for unanswered questions, for indifference, for the idea that some things simply resist explanation. People spoke of them with a mixture of respect and unease. Occasionally, someone would return to the trails, not to search, not officially, just to walk the paths that once held so much significance. These visits were quiet, personal, a way of standing where certainty had once existed, hoping that proximity might stir something dormant. It never did. The case aged in law enforcement systems as well. Paper files were digitized. Evidence lists were reformatted. Names remained unchanged, but the context around them shifted. Investigators who had once worked the case retired. Some died. Institutional memory thinned. Each transition increased the distance between the present and the moment everything had gone wrong. Public perception hardened into assumption. People decided what they believed had happened and stopped questioning it. For many, the disappearance became shorthand for the dangers of wilderness. For others, it became proof of investigative failure. For a few, it became something darker, evidence that the world was capable of swallowing people whole without explanation. All of these interpretations existed simultaneously, rarely intersecting. What was lost in that fragmentation was emotional truth, the lived reality of waiting, of never knowing, of being suspended between mourning and expectation for decades. 36 years is long enough for grief to become quiet but never leave, long enough for anger to dull into resignation, long enough for memory to feel unreliable, as though the past itself might be lying. People who once spoke daily about the case now spoke of it rarely, carefully, not because it mattered less, but because it had integrated into their lives in ways that no longer required constant articulation. It was simply there. The story also attracted new audiences, people with no personal connection, drawn by the sheer improbability of it. How could nothing be found? How could time pass without resolution? Their interest was intellectual, analytical. They studied it as a puzzle. But puzzles assume solutions. For the families, this was not a puzzle. It was an unfinished sentence. The absence of new information over such a long period created a false sense of stability. It felt as though the mystery had settled into its final form, that whatever truth existed was buried too deeply to be disturbed, that the story, while unresolved, was effectively complete. The world had moved on. Even those closest to the disappearance began to adjust their expectations. Not consciously, not decisively, just gradually. Plans for the future no longer included the possibility of sudden answers. Conversations about the case became reflective rather than anticipatory. It was easier to believe nothing would ever change than to endure repeated disappointment. The mountains continued to exist unchanged by the passage of time. Trails eroded and were rebuilt. Trees fell and were replaced. Snow came and went in cycles. Visitors arrived unaware, left unchanged, carried no knowledge of the history beneath their feet. In that constancy, there was something almost mocking. Nature had moved forward effortlessly, while human lives remained partially frozen. 36 years of not knowing created its own kind of ending, not a resolution, but a conclusion shaped by endurance. The disappearance became something people learned to live with, even as it quietly shaped every life it touched. By then, no one was searching anymore. No one expected discovery. The case had reached a point where surprises felt impossible. And that was precisely when everything changed. The discovery did not arrive with urgency or ceremony. It emerged the way truth sometimes does, unexpected, quiet, almost reluctant. It was not part of a search. No one was looking for answers anymore. The case had been dormant for decades, settled into archives and memory. Whatever remained of it existed only as a story people assumed would never change. That assumption was wrong. The land where it happened was not remote in the way people imagined. It was familiar, worked, passed through. Over the years, it had been crossed countless times without incident, its surface altered subtly by seasons and human activity. And yet, something had remained unnoticed all this time, until it didn't. The first sign was small. So small it could have been dismissed if circumstances were slightly different. A shape that didn't belong. A detail that disrupted the pattern of earth and stone just enough to catch attention. At first glance, it meant nothing. At second glance, it felt wrong. Those present did not immediately understand what they were seeing. They only understood that the ground was telling a different story than it had before. Something had been revealed, not placed there recently, but exposed. Time had done the uncovering. The response was cautious. Movement slowed. Voices lowered. No one wanted to assume too much, but no one could ignore the feeling that something significant had surfaced. Experience taught them that discoveries like this were often misinterpreted, that nature produced strange illusions all the time. Still, protocol was followed. Authorities were contacted. The area was secured. Activity halted. What had been routine became deliberate. The land was treated with a respect it had not required moments earlier. When confirmation came, it arrived without drama, not in a single statement, not with definitive language, just enough acknowledgement to change everything. This was not nothing. Word traveled quickly, though carefully. Information was limited, deliberately so. Investigators understood the weight of what this might represent, not just evidence, but history resurfacing. They moved with restraint, aware that the wrong assumption could distort truth before it had a chance to speak. For families, the news arrived like a fracture in time. Some heard through official channels, others through quiet calls from people who had never stopped paying attention. The message was never clear, never complete, just fragments, a discovery, a location, a possibility. Possibility was enough. Hope returned, but it was not the kind that lifts. It was heavy, complicated by decades of expectation and loss. Answers long imagined suddenly felt within reach, and terrifyingly close. Investigators approached the site methodically. Every movement was documented. The ground was examined in layers. History peeled back inch by inch. What emerged did so reluctantly, as though resisting the act of being seen. The evidence was incomplete, fragmented, altered by time, weather, and the slow work of the environment. Nothing here offered an immediate narrative. No clear story presented itself. Just presence. And presence was everything. What had once been a total absence now had form. Experts were consulted. Analysis began. Comparisons were made to long-held records, to descriptions that had lived only on paper for decades. Each match, each similarity, tightened the gravity of the moment. This discovery did not answer questions. It created new ones. Why here? Why now? How had this remained hidden for so long? What had shifted to allow it to surface? The mountains, silent as ever, offered no explanation. News of the find spread beyond those directly involved. Media outlets revived the story, framing it as a breakthrough, a turning point. Headlines spoke of closure, of resolution, of truth finally emerging. The language moved faster than reality. Inside the investigation, restraint ruled. No one declared victory. No one promised answers. They had learned too well what uncertainty could do. For the families, the emotional impact varied. Some felt relief, simply knowing that something had been found. Proof that the disappearance had left a mark after all, that it had not vanished entirely into myth. Others felt a resurgence of grief, so sharp it felt new, The return of the past, after so many years of forced adaptation, was destabilizing. It reopened wounds long scarred over, reminding them how much had been lost. The discovery disrupted the quiet equilibrium that had settled over the case. It forced everyone to revisit assumptions, to question conclusions long accepted out of necessity. For investigators, it was a rare second chance, an opportunity to approach the mystery not as a cold case, but as a living one, still fragile, still incomplete, but no longer static. Analysis continued slowly, deliberately. No one rushed to fill the silence. They allowed the evidence to speak in its own time, understanding that haste could distort meaning. As details emerged, they challenged expectations. Some theories weakened. Others gained unexpected weight. The narrative began to shift not toward certainty, but toward complexity. This was not the dramatic reveal people imagined when they thought of long-lost answers. It was quieter, heavier, more human. The discovery did not solve the mystery. It changed it. After 36 years of nothing, something had finally surfaced, and that something refused to fit neatly into any story that had been told before. The past, long buried, had returned, and it was not finished speaking. The evidence, once uncovered, did not behave the way people expected it to. It did not line up neatly with any single explanation. It did not point in one clear direction. Instead, it resisted certainty, offering fragments that suggested meaning without committing to it. Experts approached it with caution. Time had altered everything. Materials degraded, context shifted, markers blurred. What might have been obvious decades earlier now required interpretation layered over interpretation. Every conclusion came with an asterisk. Every finding carried limits. Forensic analysis began with fundamentals, measurements, comparisons, attempts to establish origin, age, and movement. Some elements aligned with long-held assumptions. Others contradicted them outright. This inconsistency became the defining feature of the discovery. The location itself raised questions. It was not where most theories had placed the group, not deep enough to suggest a catastrophic fall, not exposed enough to support certain environmental explanations. It sat in an uncomfortable middle ground, accessible, yet somehow overlooked. Investigators revisited maps with new urgency. Old search grids were laid over new coordinates. Areas once considered cleared were reconsidered. The realization that something could exist undetected for so long unsettled even seasoned professionals. If this had been missed, what else might have been missed? The condition of the evidence complicated matters further. Time and environment had stripped it of clarity. Natural processes had intervened, rearranged, obscured. What remained was honest but incomplete, telling only parts of story. This partial truth frustrated everyone. Families wanted answers that could be held, understood, grieved properly. Investigators wanted conclusions that could be defended. The public wanted a narrative that made sense of decades of silence. The evidence refused to satisfy any of these needs fully. Some theories gained credibility. Others lost it. A few collapsed entirely. Ideas once dismissed returned to conversation, not because they were proven, but because the discovery reopened possibilities long set aside. What became clear was what the evidence did not support. It did not suggest intentional disappearance. It did not align with certain dramatic scenarios that had captured public imagination. Those narratives, while compelling, lacked grounding in what had been found. At the same time, the evidence did not definitively confirm a simple accident. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many variables unresolved. The ambiguity was maddening. Investigators spoke carefully in public statements. Words like consistent would replace confirms. Possibility overshadowed certainty. Each update clarified one detail, while introducing 3 new uncertainties. Behind closed doors, discussions were more candid. Professionals acknowledged the limits of their tools, the erosion caused by decades of exposure, the reality that some answers were now unreachable no matter how thorough the analysis. Time had taken its toll, not just on the evidence, but on the truth itself. Families responded in different ways. Some found comfort in the narrowing of possibilities, even without resolution. Others felt the pain of renewed uncertainty, the reopening of emotional territory they had spent decades trying to navigate. The discovery had promised clarity. Instead, it delivered complexity. Media narratives struggled to adapt. Simplified explanations failed under scrutiny. Sensational angles lost credibility. The story resisted being packaged neatly, forcing a more nuanced conversation. This resistance was uncomfortable, but necessary. The evidence suggested movement, but not enough to explain how or why. It suggested presence, but not sequence. It suggested an ending, but not the path that led there. In some ways, it answered the smallest question of all. Had something been left behind? Yes. But the larger questions, the ones that mattered most, remained unanswered. What happened first? What decisions were made? What moments mattered? What could have changed the outcome? The evidence could not say. As analysis continued, investigators reached a difficult understanding. The discovery had not been a solution. It was a correction. It adjusted the story without completing it. It forced acknowledgement that earlier assumptions had been incomplete. Truth, it seemed, was not a destination but a boundary, one that could be approached but not crossed. For the families, this realization was both cruel and honest. It offered recognition without relief, validation without closure. The evidence refused to perform the emotional labor people expected of it. It existed simply as it was, real, limited, and unyielding. In the end, what it suggested mattered as much as what it refused to say. The silence within the evidence mirrored the silence that had defined the case for 36 years. Not empty, just incomplete. When the truth finally began to take shape, partial, imperfect, and long delayed, it did not land the same way for everyone. The discovery had been singular, but its impact fractured immediately, spreading outward in different directions, touching each family in ways that reflected their own years of waiting. For some, the news brought a strange sense of validation. After decades of uncertainty, there was proof that the disappearance had not been imagined, exaggerated, or forgotten. Something real had been found, something undeniable. That alone carried weight. It confirmed that their questions had always been justified, that the silence they had lived was not the result of neglect or overreaction. This validation came with relief, but not peace. Relief is often mistaken for closure. In reality, it is only the easing of one pressure, replaced quickly by another. The families who felt relief also felt the return of grief in its rawest form. The discovery reached back through time, reopening moments they had learned to survive by sealing away. For others, the evidence felt like betrayal. They had built their emotional survival on certain beliefs, carefully chosen interpretations that allowed them to function. The new information disrupted those internal narratives, forcing a reevaluation of everything they thought they understood. What had once been a stable, if painful, explanation now felt fragile. Some struggled to accept the findings at all, not because they denied reality, but because reality had arrived too late, and in pieces too small to satisfy the years of longing that preceded it. Partial answers felt cruel after such prolonged silence. Conversations within families grew complicated. Different members processed the information at different speeds, through different emotional filters. Where there had once been unity in not knowing, there was now division in interpretation. One person might see the discovery as an ending, another as an interruption. Grief does not move forward in a straight line. It loops, hesitates, retreats, and advances without warning. The return of the case into active discussion disrupted carefully maintained balances. Old arguments resurfaced. New ones emerged. Questions once avoided were asked again, this time with sharper edges. Some family members chose engagement. They attended briefings, asked questions, pushed for transparency. Others withdrew, overwhelmed by the emotional toll of reopening a wound they had spent decades managing. Neither response was wrong. Both were survival. The truth, such as it was, refused to act as a unifying force. Public reaction added another layer of complexity. Strangers expressed sympathy, curiosity, even relief on behalf of people they had never met. Well-meaning messages flooded in, offering closure where none had actually been delivered. The families learned quickly that the word closure was dangerous. It implied an ending that did not exist. It suggested healing that could be scheduled, completed, and moved past. For them, the truth did not close anything. It complicated. Some family members felt anger toward the mountains, toward investigators, toward time itself. Others felt guilt, questioning past decisions, wondering if something could have been done differently decades earlier. The discovery, rather than resolving these feelings, intensified them. There was also gratitude, though it sat uncomfortably alongside everything else. Gratitude toward those who had not forgotten, toward the chance, however small, to know more than they had known before. Gratitude, even toward the evidence itself, for existing at all. Gratitude did not mean satisfaction. As the family's process of findings, they were forced to confront a difficult truth. Knowing more did not make the loss easier. In some cases, it made it heavier. The mystery had once allowed space for imagination, for hope that things might have ended differently. The new information narrowed that space, yet it did not eliminate it. Each family carried away something different from the same set of facts. For some, the discovery marked the beginning of a new chapter of mourning, one grounded in reality rather than possibility. For others, it was simply another turn in a story that still refused to end. There were no dramatic confrontations, no collective moment of reckoning. The aftermath unfolded quietly, in private conversations, in sleepless nights, in the careful way people spoke about the past now that it had shifted slightly under their feet. The truth had arrived, but it had arrived unevenly. It did not heal everyone. It did not answer everything. What it did was remind everyone involved that loss does not age the way people expect it to. It waits. It adapts. It resurfaces when disturbed. 36 years of not knowing had shaped these lives in profound ways. Knowing a little more did not erase that shaping. It simply added new contours. The families would carry this version of the truth forward, just as they had carried every other version before it, not as an ending, but as something they would have to learn to live with. In the end, the mountains remained exactly what they had always been, present, unmoved, and uninterested in resolution. Long after the evidence was cataloged, long after statements were issued and reactions settled into quieter forms, the landscape stood unchanged. The same ridgelines cut into sky, the same trails wound through trees and stone. Snow fell and melted. Seasons passed without acknowledgement of what had been taken or what had been returned. For visitors who came later, there was nothing to mark the story. No signposts, no warnings, no memorials carved into rock. The mountains did not explain themselves, and they never tried to. Those who knew the story felt it anyway. Every familiar bend in the trail carried an echo, not audible, not visible, but present. A sense that something had happened here once, something that resisted containment by facts or timelines. The land itself felt unchanged, yet permanently altered by knowledge. This contradiction became the final truth of the case. The discovery had shifted the narrative, but it had not completed it. The evidence had narrowed the field of possibility, without closing it. Theories had been refined, not erased. The past had resurfaced, but only partially, leaving gaps that could never be filled. What remained was a haunting kind of clarity. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved completely. The human mind resists this idea. We are conditioned to expect answers, to believe that persistence guarantees understanding. We treat time as an ally, assuming it will eventually expose what it conceals. But time is indifferent. In this case, time had preserved just enough to disrupt certainty, and erased just enough to prevent closure. It had acted neither cruelly nor kindly. It had simply done what time does, moved forward without regard for meaning. For the families, this realization became part of the emotional landscape they now inhabited. They learned to carry a truth that was fragmented, to live with answers that did not resolve the question at their core. Their grief did not end. It evolved again. Some found a measure of peace not in explanation, but in acceptance. Not acceptance of what happened. That remained elusive, but acceptance of what would never be known. This was not surrender. It was adaptation. Others continued to search quietly, not for evidence, but for understanding. They returned to the mountains alone, or in small groups, walking familiar paths without expectation. These journeys were not about discovery. They were about presence, about standing in a place that had shaped their lives irrevocably and acknowledging its power. The mountains never responded. They offered no final moment of revelation, no symbolic closure. They remained vast and impersonal, their silence unchanged by human need. This silence, once terrifying, became something else over time, less an enemy, more a reality to be navigated. The absence of explanation stopped being a wound and became a condition, permanent but manageable. The case, now altered by discovery, settled into a new form, no longer defined solely by disappearance, but by the complexity of what was found and what remained missing. It resisted simplification, resisted being turned into a lesson or a warning. It existed as it was. For those who encountered the story later, it carried a different weight. It was no longer just about people who never returned. It was about the limits of knowledge, the fragility of certainty, and the uncomfortable truth that not everything yields to investigation. The mountains did not cause the mystery. They did not solve it either. They simply held it. In this way, the landscape became a mirror rather than a villain. It reflected human vulnerability, our reliance on patterns and explanations, our discomfort with ambiguity. It reminded us that nature does not operate according to narrative structure or emotional fairness. There was no final twist waiting beyond the horizon, no hidden detail that would one day emerge and tie everything together. The discovery had been the last shift, the final major change. What followed was not resolution, but reckoning. A reckoning with the idea that understanding is not guaranteed, that effort does not always equal outcome, that some stories do not end. They merely stop unfolding. The families learn to speak of the disappearance differently now, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet precision shaped by years of reflection. Their words carried less speculation and more honesty. They no longer asked what happened. They asked what remains. What remains is memory, imperfect, subjective, but enduring. What remains is impact, the way one day can fracture decades. What remains is the knowledge that love persists even when answers do not. And what remains is a mountain range itself, standing where it has always stood, unchanged by human interpretation. The trailhead still fills with people each morning. Boots still scrape against gravel. Zippers are still pulled. Coffee still steams in cold air. Promises are still made to return by nightfall. Most do. Some stories begin the same way and end very differently. This one does not offer comfort in its conclusion. It offers perspective. It reminds us that mystery is not always a failure of investigation, but sometimes a feature of existence itself. The mountains never returned what they took in full. They returned just enough to remind us that some truths surface slowly, incompletely, and without concern for our readiness. And when they do, they change everything, not by answering our questions, but by teaching us how to live without the answers we thought we needed. In the end, the mountains remain exactly what they had always been, present, unmoved, and uninterested in resolution. Long after the evidence was cataloged, long after statements were issued and reactions settled into quieter forms, the landscape stood unchanged. The same ridgelines cut into the sky, the same trails wound through trees and stone. Snow fell and melted. Seasons passed without acknowledgement of what had been taken or what had been returned. For visitors who came later, there was nothing to mark the story. No signposts, no warnings, no memorials carved into rock. The mountains did not explain themselves, and they never tried to. Those who knew the story felt it anyway. Every familiar bend in the trail carried an echo, not audible, not visible, but present. A sense that something had happened here once, something that resisted containment by facts or timelines. The land itself felt unchanged, yet permanently altered by knowledge. This contradiction became the final truth of the case. The discovery had shifted the narrative, but it had not completed it. The evidence had narrowed the field of possibility without closing it. Theories had been refined, not erased. The past had resurfaced, but only partially, leaving gaps that could never be filled. What remained was a haunting kind of clarity. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved completely. The human mind resists this idea. We are conditioned to expect answers, to believe that persistence guarantees understanding. We treat time as an ally, assuming it will eventually expose what it conceals. But time is indifferent. In this case, time had preserved just enough to disrupt certainty and erased just enough to prevent closure. It had acted neither cruelly nor kindly. It had simply done what time does, moved forward without regard for meaning. For the families, this realization became part of the emotional landscape they now inhabited. They learned to carry a truth that was fragmented, to live with answers that did not resolve the question at their core. Their grief did not end. It evolved again. Some found a measure of peace not in explanation, but in acceptance. Not acceptance of what happened. That remained elusive. But acceptance of what would never be known. This was not surrender. It was adaptation. Others continued to search quietly, not for evidence, but for understanding. They returned to mountains alone or in small groups, walking familiar paths without expectation. These journeys were not about discovery. They were about presence, about standing in a place that had shaped their lives irrevocably and acknowledging its power. The mountains never responded. They offered no final moment of revelation, no symbolic closure. They remained vast and impersonal, their silence unchanged by human need. This silence, once terrifying, became something else over time. Less an enemy, more reality to be navigated. The absence of explanation stopped being a wound and became a condition, permanent but manageable. The case, now altered by discovery, settled into a new form, no longer defined solely by disappearance, but by the complexity of what was found and what remained missing. It resisted simplification, resisted being turned into a lesson or a warning. It existed as it was. For those who encountered the story later, it carried a different weight. It was no longer just about people who never returned. It was about the limits of knowledge, the fragility of certainty, and the uncomfortable truth that not everything yields to investigation. The mountains did not cause a mystery. They did not solve it either. They simply held it. In this way, the landscape became a mirror rather than a villain. It reflected human vulnerability, our reliance on patterns and explanations, our discomfort with ambiguity. It reminded us that nature does not operate according to narrative structure or emotional fairness. There was no final twist waiting beyond the horizon, no hidden detail that would one day emerge and tie everything together. The discovery had been the last shift, the final major change. What followed was not resolution, but reckoning. A reckoning with the idea that understanding is not guaranteed, that effort does not always equal outcome, that some stories do not end, they merely stop unfolding. The families learn to speak of the disappearance differently now, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet precision shaped by years of reflection. Their words carried less speculation and more honesty. They no longer asked what happened. They asked what remains. What remains is memory, imperfect, subjective, but enduring. What remains is impact, the way one day can fracture decades. What remains is a knowledge that love persists even when answers do not. And what remains is a mountain range itself, standing where it has always stood, unchanged by human interpretation. The trailhead still fills with people each morning. Boots still scrape against gravel. Zippers are still pulled. Coffee still steams in cold air. Promises are still made to return by nightfall. Most do. Some stories begin the same way and end very differently. This one does not offer comfort in its conclusion. It offers perspective. It reminds us that mystery is not always a failure of investigation, but sometimes a feature of existence itself. The mountains never returned what they took in full. They returned just enough to remind us that some truths surface slowly, incompletely, and without concern for our readiness. And when they do, they change everything, not by answering our questions, but by teaching us how to live without the answers we thought we needed.